Hello students, today we're going to look at factoring differences of squares and perfect square trinomials. So we're just going to do them separate because they're pretty different. Okay. First we're going to start with differences of squares. A difference of squares is just what that says. A difference, which means there's a minus sign, between two perfect squares. Okay. For instance, we could have x squared minus 9. X squared minus 9. X squared is a perfect square because it's squared. 9 is a perfect square. 3 times 3 is 9. And there's a minus sign between it. That means it's a difference of squares. If there's a plus sign, it doesn't work. And a difference of squares is always a binomial. So we got to look and make sure we understand what a difference of squares is before we can factor it. Perfect squares being subtracted as a binomial. That's what a difference of squares is. To factor a difference of squares, I'm going to come up with two binomials. Square root of the first term is x and x. Square root of the second term is 3 and 3. One of them is going to be plus, one is going to be minus. That's it. Now you're thinking, how in the world does that work? You remember from maybe a week ago, we did one where it was x plus 3 times x minus 3, and we got x squared, if we do FOIL, minus 3x plus 3x minus 9. Remember this? And these two cancel each other out because negative 3x plus 3x is 0. So I'm left with x squared minus 9. Oh yeah. So again, difference of squares, square root of the first term, square root of the second term, and then one's plus and one's minus. So another one. Let's do 4y squared minus 25. Is 4 a perfect square? Yes. Is y squared a perfect square? Yes. Is 25 a perfect square? Yes. Are they being subtracted? Yes. So this is a difference of squares. So I'm going to take the square root of the first term, 2y, square root of the second term, 25, 2y, 25, one's plus, one's minus, and there I am. That's factoring a difference of squares. Again, if there's a plus sign between those two, it doesn't work that way. If there's a plus sign, there's nothing else you can do. But if there's a minus sign between the two perfect squares, you can factor it like this. The next thing we want to look at is a perfect square trinomial. A perfect square trinomial, when factored, gives you two of the same binomial. So this binomial times itself equals a perfect square trinomial. Now, how do we look at a perfect square trinomial, or at a trinomial, and see if it's a perfect square? Here's what you do. You look at the last term. Is 36 a perfect square? Yes. What is the square root of 36? It is 6. Wow, why did I just put a 2? The square root of 36 is 6. If I double that square root and I get the middle term, then it's a perfect square trinomial. What is 6 times 2? 12. You're exactly right. So 6 times 2 is 12. This makes it a perfect square trinomial. Let's look over at this one. Okay, we're going to keep going. I'm just going to show you. Look at the last term. 9. Is that a perfect square? Yes, it is. Okay, what is the square root of 9? 3. When I double 3, do I get 6? Oh, that says negative 6. But a square root of 9 is also negative 3. Negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9. So if I take that negative 3 as a square root, then I take negative 3 times 2 and I get negative 6. That makes that a perfect square trinomial. So that's how I judge if it's a perfect square trinomial. So let's look here. Perfect square trinomial? Yes. If it's a perfect square trinomial, then I take the square root of the first term and the square root of the second term and square it. Because x plus 6 squared is x squared plus 12x plus 36. Now if you don't believe me, let's try it. X plus 6 times x plus 6 is x squared plus 6x plus 6x plus 36 plus 12x, and that's a perfect square trinomial. So once again, if I can tell it's a perfect square trinomial, because I take that last term, find the square root, and then double it, if that is the case, it's a perfect square trinomial, then I just take the square root of the first term, add it to the square root of the second term, squared. Over here, I've got a negative in the middle, so that just means that the sign there is going to be negative. X squared and the square root of that is x. Take the square root of 9, which is 3, squared, and that's how I factor a perfect square trinomial. I bet you were thinking to yourself, but Mr. Coens, what if A is bigger than 1? What do I do? Well, very good question. You're going to do about the same thing. First of all, I need to see, is this a perfect square trinomial? Because now I have A being bigger than 1, I have to first see if that's a perfect square, and it is. And the square root of that is 2. And the square root of 25 is 5. So then I multiply those two numbers together. 5 times 2 is 10. Then I double it and see if I get my middle term. And I did. I multiplied 5 times 2, I got 10. Double it, got 20. That makes it a perfect square trinomial. I'm going to say that again. Square root of the first term times the square root of the last term, doubled, and then, excuse me, if this is double, then it is a perfect square trinomial. And so then the factors of the perfect square trinomial would be the square root of the first term plus the square root of the second term squared. Excuse me. And that is how you factor a perfect square trinomial that has a coefficient, or a leading coefficient, that's bigger than 1. Again, we have to look at it and see, is it a perfect square trinomial? Checking to see. Square root times square root doubled equals a middle term, then it's a perfect square trinomial. And here are your practice problems for this video. The first one says, is this a difference of squares? If it is, factor it. The first one is y squared minus 81. First of all, put yes or no, is it a difference of squares? And if it is yes, then factor it. The second one is 4y squared plus 16. For the second part, is this a perfect square trinomial? If so, factor it. So the first one is x squared minus 15x plus 64. First, tell me, is it a perfect square trinomial? If it is, then factor it. The second one is 9y squared plus 60y plus 100. Make sure you have those done before you come to the math workshop.